We're back, better than ever. Hey,
In the house.
In the house. Once again, Hottie Lewis.
Stephen Lee.
Jorge Mendoza.
Jorge Mendoza, not to be confused with George, but we've cleared that up a long time ago.
We're kind of doing the new intro now.
Yeah.
Do you like that?
I like it. I mean, just being able to switch it up a little bit.
Okay,
you never going to know what you're going to get.
Keep y'all on y'all toes.
You never know what you're going to get. But, I mean, you do know what you're going to get as it relates to these first few podcasts that we're doing because we're talking about the divide in our country.
Yeah.
We're talking about how, as believers, responsible, how we can be advocates and not agitators. Yeah. And we've been walking through the different things. Should we test Jorge this time?
Let's do it, man. Y'all got me last time, man.
We tested him at 3. Now we're on 6. So we're going to test you, Jorge.
What happened?
We're trying to see if you can embody, if you're embodying these R's
I'm already failed.
that we have.
Yeah.
Look at he's trying to get the thing.
Where's his notes?
Oh, man, all right. I'm sorry, y'all. Yeah. These R's really are dear to us. These are really,
I got
really dear to us.
I got my cheat sheet right here.
Your cheat sheet, yeah.
They didn't email that to me.
So we talk about rely on the power of prayer.
Rely on the power of prayer.
Number 2.
To fully acknowledge God's grace.
All right.
That was an R.
That wasn't an R. What is the R? He made me messed up the R. You're just like, what? Fully acknowledge.
To fully acknowledge God's grace.
To require the full acknowledge. Requires the full acknowledge.
Yeah, okay.
Requires the full acknowledge of God's grace. To run to the tension of injustice, but run with the heart of reconciliation.
Okay.
And then last time we talked about to relate to all parties with concern. So today we're going to talk about to respond with humility. Respond with humility rather than superiority. And this, I think, is critical because here you got the Apostle Paul, who wrote 13 books of the New Testament, who is speaking to Philemon, who wrote how many books of the New Testament?
Philemon?
Yeah.
I'm going to go with
Paul. How many did Paul write?
How did Philemon write?
Oh, Philemon?
Yeah.
He didn't write any.
He didn't write any.
That was a trick.
He's trying to catch y'all on your toes. He didn't write any, right? So you have one man who God used to write 13 books and one man to write 0 books. And what's interesting is in these verses, you see kind of Paul's humility. Verse 13 and 14, he said, in verse 8, really, he started off, he says, "For this reason, although I have great boldness in Christ to command you to do what is right," he says in verse 9, "I appeal to you instead on the basis of love." So that's one. Verse 13, he says, "I wanted to keep him with me so that in my imprisonment for the gospel, he might serve in your place. But I didn't want to do anything without your consent so that your good deed might not be out of obligation, but your own free will." Wow. Here you go, the Apostle Paul, who says, man, I have the authority to do it. Yeah. As a matter of fact, it's actually better for me if he does stay with me. Yeah. But I am, in a sense, submitting to you, in that way, and to say, man, I'm sitting because I don't want you to just be doing this out of obligation. Wow. Man, that's powerful.
It is.
You know what I mean? And I think that's gospel because that's the very essence of the opposite of what we do when it comes to those types of situations. We kind of get this sense of justified righteousness. Yeah. And if I'm right, I don't need to be humble. Yeah. Like, the two don't have to go in the same. Yeah. And so, I mean, this idea of humility, I think it's cool. Yeah. I mean, because humility is two things. Everyone knows humility is not prideful, right? It's like, boasting who they are. But a lot of times people embrace humility as kind of what I call the Eeyore complex. Eeyore, I'm the worst of all people. It's just kind of like we have that Eeyore mindset. Yeah. But all that is inverted pride. Yeah. But true humility is recognize that it's not about you. Yeah. And I think this is what we see with the Apostle Paul, the one who has wrote 13 books of the New Testament, saying it's not about me. Yeah. How hard is it, especially in the midst of conflict and tension, to make this thing not about you?
Yeah. Man, I often think about that and just, I've told y'all, at times, man, I'll kind of wander onto my Facebook page and I'll have just certain kind of conversations. And I'm not typically the type of person that, interacting on social media gets kind of emotionally drawn in. But I remember having a conversation, this was a few weeks ago, and it was just kind of crazy to see how quickly that conversation turned to really kind of turn for this other person into me kind of bringing up kind of historical facts about race relations, about the some of the things that we see in our culture because of just economic disparities. And by the end of that conversation, I have been called a racist. I've been called race baiting, and obviously I think the empathy that I had in that particular situation was one where I think at a point in my life of understanding, like, okay, I'm not going to judge this particular person by that conversation. But I think for me, in that instance, I think it was an example to me of how at times, man, we're just really, what's most important in sometimes these conversations is not the place of reconciliation. It's, I want you to know that I'm right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And just how that, and I could imagine if I would have kind of taken the bait,
Mm-hmm.
that I would have called her everything under the sun.
Mm-hmm.
And so again, I think that's a microcosm of what we see in our culture. I mean, we always kind of talk about just the proverbial kind of throwing grenades over your fence.
Mm-hmm.
And I think as bridge builders, I think one of the tensions that we try to embrace is to open the fence, is to actually kind of go out and to have civil conversation about some of the things that we see in culture.
Jorge, you've talked about this in the past. I know this idea of the person of privilege having the responsibility, to lean into that. I don't know if you remember or if you know what I'm talking about. It's, I mean, because a lot of times you see in the scriptures, it's the perfect person of privilege that the Bible is speaking to reach back to those that are lowly, and and it's just kind of like, and so you see Paul, even though he's not using his position, he's the one who's advocating, but he's advocating from a posture of humility.
Yeah.
And, I mean, how important is that, especially as we're talking to leaders and pastors and influencers, people who are being looked to, in these times. How can they become advocates, not agitators, in these type of scenarios? And when it's, to some degree, it's their responsibility to be an advocate.
Yeah, I think because any platform or authority or power that God has given us, even the Apostle Paul says it in a number of places. He says, the authority that God has given me is to build up and not to tear down. Because we see the same, and I think it was in the Corinthian correspondence, right? He said, I can come and I could wreck shop and I could discipline, I could do all this stuff. And that's not really what I'm inclined towards. The same thing I think we see in Peter's admonition to the elders that he was writing to. He says, when he says, don't lord it over the flock, it's just, we have to be very careful, because their authority and privilege and power and whatever resources that God has given us, we recognize them as gifts, but those are gifts that could be easily abused. And I think we just, if God has placed us in a position to wield authority, power over other people, just to be on guard. It's an inherent reality in a fallen world, in a fallen system, in a fallen, the already not yet reality, even for redeemed people, that we could take advantage of the position that we're in and use it for our advantage over others. And unfortunately, we see it in the scriptures and we see it in history happen repeatedly.
I love, when I think about this idea of, responding with humility versus superiority, it reminds me of the Joshua 5:13 through 15, the commander of the Lord's army. It talks about when Joshua was in Jericho and, he lifted his eyes up and he saw this man standing before him, and Joshua asked him, so whose side are you on? Are you for us or for Jericho? He was just like, I'm for neither. I'm on the Lord's side. And I think that's the true posture of humility. When you recognize that it's not about me, it's not about the offended, it's not about the offendee, it's really about the glory of the Lord. And if we take on that posture in every situation, in every case, that it's about God's glory and what's going to bring God and Christ most fame, most glory, make him most known, I think that's always should be our heart's posture. And I think it gives us the ability not to, have to lord over, or and those types of things. So I just think that's always something that kind of resonates with me as I try to take in, because in church you're always dealing with conflict. It don't even have to be about race and tension. It could be about, she stepped in my toe roll. I mean,
she parked
in my parking space. She's sitting in my seat. It could be about anything in the church. We just feel like we find things to fight about.
I love what you said. I mean, I think the foundation that we started here with just the first podcast was prayer. And I think the reason why that wasn't so important is I think it continues to remind us that there's one who is an authority and has power to do what we can't do. And I think often, the tug that we see in culture is, I think one of the things that we often battle with is the feeling that we need to be on a side that appears to be winning or winning, kind of advancing. So sometimes I think what it means to be Christians in our culture, really, it doesn't feel heroic.
Yeah.
You know, it doesn't feel like we're accomplishing much ground. And so sometimes, the reason that we choose the Democratic side, the Republican side, because it feels like there's an agenda that really is making sense in culture. Here's what this party platform promises. And so I think I think that's the tension that we face of I think being reminded of what we talked about in the first two podcasts of prayer, grace, allowing us to kind of view that as a place where we can allow our fears to rest more so than being defined by that. So I just think that's an important fact as we continue to kind of come back to what we're talking about as countercultural. This is not the norm in the way that people talk, interact, and but just the importance of what Christ is called to do. And really, again, I think Paul, I think this book is just a gem. I wonder how many people have really kind of taken time to kind of think through the implications of what Paul is doing right here. Man, this is right where our culture is. And it's just, in this small little book that most people have probably never preached on, read, really kind of speaks to where our culture is and kind of clear solutions for Christians with some of the things that we're dealing with.
Yeah, I'm 100% agree. And I think this is that type of humility that when we understand that if we're always fighting for our rights, you might win the battle, but you'll lose the war. Ultimately, I mean, that happens in marriage. Like you might win the battle, but you lost. Like if you won, you lost, brother. So husbands, take note. If don't win, because if you win, you lose. You lose. So it's just kind of like. But I think that's the same thing in Christ, and it's not like giving in for giving in's sake, but it really is that, like, man, fighting for God's glory is the most important thing. More than anything else. And it's really avoiding passivity, avoiding. Taking on responsibility, but understanding that it's not about us; it's about Him.
Yeah, Jorge, I was thinking a little bit about Jorge, man. Like in this particular question, what do you think that we can learn? I think just from history, as you kind of think about this, the church has not always been at a place of prominence, a place where, where we've kind of been in positions of political power. Like, what can we learn from the historical church at times? That really maybe perhaps the position of humility is more reflective of kind of the historical church. Like, what do you think is maybe some things that we can learn from history, culture, as perhaps we kind of think about just some of the kind of the cultural changes that we're seeing in our culture now with Christianity being more marginalized? And, are there some things that you perhaps, man, just kind of thoughts, observations?
I think, a couple of things. I think one is really becoming students of the book of Acts, because I think that one of the things that Paul is doing in the book of Acts is writing an apologetic for a culture at large, right? A Theophilus, most understand that he was kind of a wealthy, member of society, and who had become a believer, and Paul is kind of giving him, Luke is giving him not only the story of how the gospel spread, but also how do you navigate the gospel in a culture, in a context that is often hostile to your faith.
That's good.
So and one of the things that Luke shows us repeatedly throughout the book of Acts is Paul's relationships with people in political authority. And often they are his friends. He befriends these people. And when I saw that, and I saw some of the Christian circles that I was kind of a part of or aware of, they view kind of politics as the enemy. And I said, well, that wasn't Paul's posture. So I think one is, man, how do we befriend these people? How do we strike up genuine relationships with people in authority? And then obviously Paul tells us to pray for them. So you look at what Paul does and the counsel that he gives throughout the New Testament is what Dhati has been talking about here, advocates and not agitators. And he goes, let's pray for peaceful, quiet lives, and so we can go on with the business of the gospel and making disciples, which would be, you know, if we didn't have to deal with all of this mayhem going on in society, we could be making disciples, and you know, and not having to deal with these ethnic hurdles that, you know, that people, you know, Christianity is a white man's religion. Look what, you know, so I think one. So on the other hand too, I think, you know, the church in America particularly has been in a lot of places in a lot of different seasons, and what I mean by this is a part of the church has been marginalized, but a part of the church has always been in the position of prominence and ministering from the center. So I think the white church has always been at the center, whereas and ministered from a position of privilege and a position of authority with resources. But the African American church, for example, has usually been on the margins, and now I think increasingly the church in general is being pushed to the margins. So I think what can we do? What can white Christians learn from the historic black church about being faithful to Christ on the margins and being disciples on the margins? So just paying attention to those kind of things that have happened. Because we're not, you know, we're not the first generation that has to deal with these tensions. The church was born in a context where it dealt with these particular tensions that we're dealing with. That's why you look back and you're like, man, there's so much in here about ethnic tension because it was in the cradle of that kind of society where you had Roman citizenship and then you had everybody else, right? Second class citizens, and the gospel comes in and breaks all of that. So when Paul says there is neither Jew nor Gentile, and so you have the religious pride on the other side, right? With the Jewish people saying, man, we're the OGs in this, we know what's up. And you had the cultural Romans that said, we're the prominent, we're in authority. So you had both of these groups, and Paul comes in, well, there's neither Jew nor Gentile, male or female, slave or free, and these class, gender, economic castes are kind of shattered in the gospel, and they're made family.
That's good.
And that's what I think made the gospel such a transformative force, or the church a transformative force, by living out the implications of the gospel. We have examples of the church not living out the implications of the gospel, and it's disastrous, and it leaves effects for generations.
Well, I think, man, what you said, which is so important, was it's really, I think, for us in the church to guard against mission drift. I think that these places of prominence and our particular political party being in power, we begin to lose sight of, like, what's the mission? The mission is for God's glory to be advanced, for disciples to be made. And at times, you know, I think, you know, the prominence in some sense, and actually, I think it confused us to thinking like, oh, like that is actually God's will more so. And so we've lost track of the particular assignment.
Right.
I think,
and it happens in every culture. You know, we see it. I think an evidence of this is, you know, according to the polls, 80% of white evangelicals voted for Trump. All right. And the signs of kind of like, I'm voting my culture over against my other values. But it happens in minority churches too. For example, first generation churches that refuse to change, ministering in English or Korean or Chinese. Why? Because they value their culture more than reaching the community around them. So it's not, it happens to all of us. We all have to be aware of that to not lose sight of the mission, and just be aware how our own culture, whatever it is, tends to creep in and dominate. So culture isn't evil; it's a good thing. But culture has a way of creeping in and wanting to become Lord, and that's where we need to check it, because Jesus is Lord, and we need to reflect Him in how we do everything from ministry to family to engage with culture.
That's a good reminder. Dhati, you got anything, bro?
Nah, y'all, it was just good seeing y'all talk. It was just like, man, the heavens were ringing as you guys were speaking on that.
That was good. That was
good. I love being a fly on the wall.
I was encouraged by
Hopefully you guys was equally as blessed out there. So
all right,
that's it.
I think that's it. That podcast. We out.
Peace.
Holla.